So a little tiny background. I went to public high schools in LA, Washington, which now is a charter school, by the way. I also went to community college. I went to Los Angeles Harbor College back in the early 60s. I always like to say I'm a child of the California Master Plan for Higher Education. And then I went to Cal State Chico, actually it was Chico State, for 4 years. And then I taught high school for 2 years back in the late 60s, my favorite moment to teach, by the way. And then I taught political science and international relations at Chico for about 34 years. And then I taught at Skyline, I taught history for 8 years, Skyline Community College. And so I have a personal view of the process that we are going to talk about, and that's the corporatization and the privatization of public education. Also, I sit on the editorial board of UPWA, by the way, just point of information. I think everybody knows or has examples of what we mean by privatization. Let me just go through a couple examples. State and local budget cuts resulting in teacher and staff layoffs, increased teacher-student ratios, and the reduction of class offerings, particularly in the humanities, social sciences, the arts, and physical education, which also can lead to school closing. Federal, state, and local government support for privatized charter schools, increasing the cost of education by raising student tuition, therefore forcing students to pay an even larger share of the cost of higher education. The implication is the shifting of the role of public higher education in society from being a right to being a privilege. You can have it if you can pay for it. Students forced to borrow huge sums of money from Wall Street banks to pay for their education. The proliferation of non-full-time teachers or adjuncts at the community college level and the state college level, not earning benefits and having salaries about a third of what full-time faculty earn, et cetera. The list is very, very long. I have about 5 or 6 points that I would like to make related to this story. My overall objective is to try to explain why this is happening right now. And when I say right now, it really began in the late 70s and early 80s, this move towards privatization and also corporatization of public education. What we mean by corporatization, it's been obviously referred to in the previous comments by Nina and Steve, and that is to run private colleges and universities and high schools and elementary schools as if they were a business. That means to run it for profit and also to use assessments for performance based on salaries and whether people have jobs, et cetera, et cetera. I think we have a clear understanding of what privatization means. The first major point I want to make is that the modern public education system was formed in the late 19th century, starting around 1880. And there have been 3 different phases of public education in the United States. And each stage, we see a specific relationship that public education has had to the political economy. And I think what we're going to try to show is that as the political economy has changed to different forms and different stages, there have been at the same time moves to restructure education to provide serve the needs of the dominant capitalist economy. The first phase was basically from about 1880 to about 1945. Now, related to serving the political economy, I want to argue that there was not necessarily a direct relation between public education and corporations or business in the sense that schools were run for a profit. What's what the role of public education during this first phase was basically to socialize a workforce in a number of ways. And I think all of us are very aware it's kind of appropriate. We're in the Finnish hall here to talk about immigrants from Europe. But that first phase was to educate or socialize immigrants, urban dwellers who were in the working class, as to be Americans, to be good Americans, to be patriots, to teach civics as well, also to teach English, to teach a certain version of American history. So this socialization was very important. There was also a hidden agenda in the socialization process as well, and at the core of that, and there's lots of literature on this point, the core of this was to teach students on various levels, in this instance particularly secondary and elementary, is how to respect authority and how to take orders and be obedient to authority, which could easily be translated over to the job site. The second role was channeling, meaning the curriculums were designed to channel students into particular sectors of the economy and particular levels of the economy. Public high schools generally were oriented towards basics, vocational education, and also into the middle strata of the petty bourgeoisie, professional classes, secretaries and the like. On the state college levels, the channeling was into agriculture and agricultural research, into certain technologies, et cetera, et cetera. What is also important about each stage is there's a specific role of the federal government in promoting or facilitating public education. I would argue in the first phase, the federal government's role was to kind of facilitate a context or a framework for public education. I think one of the more significant acts that came out of Congress was the 1862 Morrill Act, which promoted the formation of land-grant colleges. There was a revision of that act in 1890, which expanded resources for land-grant colleges as well as agricultural colleges. And it's not by accident. You can look all over the country, particularly in the Midwest and the West, you see the proliferation of state colleges. I spent most of my life in Chico, and Chico was one of these colleges starting back in the 1880s. Now, the only real link that the public schools had with the private sector, I would argue, was related to market considerations. Public schools were consumers, building buildings, facilities, gyms, sporting fields, buying supplies, buying textbooks, buying foodstuffs, et cetera, et cetera. So public schools were basically a consumer with the private sector at that point. The second phase is about 1945 to about 1980. And during this period, what we see is a number of major themes. I think everybody in the room here is a child of that period. Obviously, the golden age, the expansion of corporate capitalism in a historic form, creating new middle classes and well-paid living wage workers during that period. It was also the period of the Cold War and hostilities with the Soviet Union. Now, I think public education played the same roles, socialization, channeling as well. Now, related to socialization, I think the key thing was to teach us duck and cover, to be afraid of the Soviet Union, to teach us American exceptionalism, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they did a pretty darn good job of that until the 60s hit. Related to channeling, owing to the expansion of the political economy, particularly in the area of social services, the welfare state, et cetera, A lot of the channeling was into social work, it was into teaching, library science, and a variety of things like that. And curriculums on the elementary, secondary level, and the community colleges and the state colleges facilitated that. The state colleges and the universities also were involved in research in a number of fields, graduate level, certainly into military research. So that's a new role for the universities. There was in 1958, after Sputnik, there was a law passed by the Congress, signed by President Eisenhower, called the National Defense Education Act, which we see now federal government getting more involved in shaping and influencing and financing public education. This is going to be a significant moment in this story. And the goal in that act, the National Defense Education Act, was to train individuals in areas that would help the U.S. to be competitive with the Soviet Union: engineering, science, math, applied science, and the like. Also, on a personal level, having been an Africanist teaching at the university level, we see the formation of area studies promoted by the State Department and other resources from the federal government in the 1950s. African studies units, Asian studies units, et cetera, to develop experts related to these corresponding fields. Obviously, much of it was about diplomacy, but it was also researchers helping the CIA and the Pentagon to understand who the good guys and who the bad guys were in these areas as well. Foreign languages were promoted very strongly during this period as well, particularly for elementary schools and high schools. So you could develop individuals, officials, statespersons, et cetera, to be able to communicate in the native languages of these societies. Related to socialization and channeling, I think those are some things that happened. There's another role that public education, particularly on the college level, JCs and universities, performed, and that was to be a reserve labor pool for high school graduates where there were not necessarily slots or niches for them directly to go into the productive side of the economy. Now, what we also see in the middle 50s through the 60s is an expansion of federal involvement in public education to parallel the civil rights movement in particular. There was a Cold War dimension to the federal government supporting civil rights, which we could get into later. But we see, particularly under the Johnson administration, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a significant educational act, the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965 being passed. These laws played a major role in the philosophy or the ideology of what I like to call the New Deal corporate liberal model of governance at that particular stage. One, to provide funding for impoverished communities so they could have access to education, to promote and defend civil rights for people of African-American background and other minorities, and in particular to promote civil rights for people with special needs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this was during a period of reform. We could go into that period in much, much more detail, but I'd like to shift to the real focus of what I'd like to talk about, and that's the accelerated process of corporatization and privatization that began in the 70s, and I tend to use 1980 as the benchmark. Now, as I hope I've been able to explain, that at each stage, the political economy of the United States, and maybe even more significantly, or just as significantly, the relationship of the United States and the global economy helped to determine the orientation, the function, and the structure of public education. To me, we talk about the 60s as the decade of change. Well, many of us have been from that decade. Certainly a lot of things did change. But I like to argue that the 1970s was the real decade of change. And what I mean by that, of structural economic change. And this structural economic change was pushed by a number of factors. The Marxist perspective argues that the driving reason for this was by the late 1960s, corporations were experiencing a falling rate of profit. And we could go into great detail of what that means. And so by the late 60s, early 70s, corporations began trying to figure out why their profits are declining and what could they do about that. And part of what they basically decided was that they were going to pack up from the Northeast corridor and transfer industrial production to areas of the United States, and then almost simultaneously to areas in the world, particularly the Third World. Some of it was to the so-called Sun Belt, but most of it was to Mexico, Argentina, Singapore, Brazil, et cetera, where labor costs were cheap. Governments were backed up by the United States. These were right-wing or dictatorial governments that the U.S. backed up, and part of why they did was because these governments prevented the rise of labor unions and organizing on other levels. And so we see a shift of the production of goods to the Third World, and that has obviously continued to this moment. Lately, in the last 10, 15 years, China has been the basic platform for production. In doing that, what we see is a couple things. One is the restructuring of the U.S. economy from an industrial-based economy to basically a service-based economy. And as that process got underway, corporations began to lobby the government and use media to denigrate the public sector. And hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars were used by corporations through its media to have this drumbeat through the 1970s that the state is bad and the market is good. Public sector is bad and inefficient. The private sector is efficient. And that was the beginning of the creation of a new ideology in the United States, or at least a new version of liberalism. There have been basically three versions of liberalism throughout American history. The first is classical liberalism, which is fundamentally free market capitalism. The second phase, starting about 1900 and institutionalized by Roosevelt, was corporate liberalism, where government played a role in stimulating demand using Keynesian mechanisms. And then by the mid-70s, we see the dismantlement of corporate liberalism, the political center moving to the right, and the rise of neoliberalism as the framework for public policy and socialization. Now, what was neoliberalism? Neoliberalism called for the following things. One, to deregulate the economy because regulation was inefficient, cuts into profit margins. You want to privatize the public sector, hence privatizing education. You want to, therefore, smash the public sector. You kind of see what I'm leading to? Okay. Okay, thank you. Where was I? Okay. Where was I? Okay. Yeah, you want to smash the public sector, privatize it. You want to cut taxes for the wealthy. And every president since Reagan has done it, including Obama, by the way, and Clinton. And we just recently had a major tax cut as well. And also, you want to smash unions as well. So now we have the guidelines for the neoliberal public policy model, but I also think that it's one side of the same coin. The other side is a neoliberal accumulation model, okay? And we need to talk about what accumulation model means. Basically, an accumulation model is what sectors and means and relationships to labor capital uses to generate profit, okay? From the 1880s, let's say to 1860, slavery was the accumulation model, okay? From about the 1880s up through the 1960s, a national development model based on domestic production was fundamentally the accumulation model. You produce goods, you hire workers, union workers, they have living wages. Ford started this, obviously. If we call that Fordism as the model of labor production. And where am I? Accumulation model, yeah. The industrial model was using domestic production, living wages. Your consumers buy goods, produce profits, and therefore profits are made. Under the neoliberal model, we see a shift in the accumulation model from production to profits from outsourcing, profits from speculation, profits from deregulation, profits from privatization of the public sector, and tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm leading to is when we're talking about privatization and corporatization, we can look at each issue, each level, each perspective, each concern that we have. But what I want to argue, it's part of this broad accumulation model. So we're not just fighting against school boards or state legislatures, we're actually fighting against capital's need, imperative to profit, okay? Now the next point really quickly I want to say is that out of this, and this was referred to earlier, is that what has developed is what a fellow named Alan Singer calls a educational, political, industrial complex. And what we mean by that, there are a number of independent but loosely affiliated businesses, government agencies, foundations, think tanks, and the like that have similar objectives and purposes to push their particular expertise or their particular power base towards the further privatization of education. Let me quickly go through some of these. Where are we here? Some of them have already been referred to. Aspire, for example, would be one of these things. But we have foundations. Steve mentioned Gates, Broad, Walton, Heritage Foundation, think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, Brookings, the Council on Foreign Relations, publishing firms. Obviously, the most powerful is Persons. In 2010, they earned some $4 billion in profits, and they've captured 60% of the United States markets for books and for computer technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And what they want to do is to use this technology to reduce costs, to get rid of the teacher and pedagogy. Keep in mind that my mom taught school up until 2 weeks before I was born. So I was always in front of the classroom, even in the womb, okay? So you can see what my commitment is to pedagogy, okay? And also to turn the classroom over to computerized tutorials and have the teachers that are left simply be the monitor of the tutorials, okay? Now, what does this do? This obviously eliminates the humanities. It What is it? It eliminates humanities and arts and music, which they've already done. You get rid of the teacher. You abolish critical thinking. You also get rid of revisionist history, meaning the truth, meaning Howard Zinn, et cetera, et cetera. And everything is defined by what they tell you. And Nina earlier mentioned what the alphabet is. It's V for Verizon, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the kind of world they want, okay? Because they want robots that will just take orders and not raise questions. And obviously they want to smash unions. I did want to comment on my final point, I have to say this, is the Trump administration. Okay. By the way, after his journey, and my real interest is foreign policy, international political economy, and that's what most of what I've written is published in. And so even though I'm not teaching anymore, I'm still following this stuff very, very closely. And I do have various forums where I'm able to present some of my ideas. But I watch Trump very closely, and obviously the most, I don't want to use the word evil, but the person I dislike the most in his administration is Betsy DeVos, okay? All right. And I could tell you some of the things she's done and what she's claiming she's going to do, et cetera. But the point I want to make, and this is a really important point at this historical moment, because we're living through a major transition in world history. I hope we all understand that. The old order is collapsing right in front of our eyes, okay? And something is going to reemerge, whether it's the totalitarian state that we fear, or whether it's some kind of democratic socialism that we aspire to, pardon the use of that word. But we're in a transition. And one of the problems I have is when we look at Trump, not me, but everybody else, or a lot of other people, when we look at Trump, people immediately think, well, if only Clinton had been elected, okay, things would be okay. But my view is there's a bipartisan consensus for this project. And it operates sometimes in stealth, sometimes very obviously, and it operates in a staggered level. Some issues are pushed, others are on the wayside. But there's a constant trajectory, and the Democrats are as culpable as the Republicans are. And the thing about Trump and DeVos related to education, they're simply accelerating what Reagan, what Bush 1, what Clinton did, what Bush 2, and what Obama did. There's no difference. It's just the acceleration of the same project. So we have to be very careful about our loyalties to the Democratic Party. Okay, thank you.